My daughter was standing on my terrace in a bathrobe, holding a coffee mug, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd shown up uninvited. The problem was, it was my terrace, my villa, my name on the deed. I'm Gary Hoffman, 67 years old. I spent 30 years building a commercial construction company in Sacramento from the ground up. Permits, concrete, impossible clients, 12-hour days, the kind of work that doesn't leave you much room for self-pity. I know how to hold a line. I know how deals work, and I know when someone's trying to run one past me. Apparently, my own daughter thought I'd forgotten all of that. It was a Friday afternoon. I'd driven 2 hours up from Sacramento to Lake Tahoe, a trip I'd made hundreds of times over the years. Linda and I had bought the villa 22 years ago, picked out every tile, every fixture, every piece of furniture together. She passed 3 years ago, and the villa was the one place I still felt like she hadn't completely left. Her reading chair was still by the window. Her coffee mugs were still in the cabinet. I wasn't ready to change any of it. So, when I pulled into the driveway that Friday and saw Carol standing on the terrace with a man I recognized as her husband, Richard, I figured they'd decided to visit without telling me. Annoying, but fine. Then Carol saw me, and her expression didn't soften. It went harder. "Dad," she set her mug down on the railing. "You can't stay here. Well, Richard and I are having a weekend to ourselves. You need to go." I stood there with my bag in my hand and just stared at her for a second. Carol is 37 years old. She was wearing one of the villa's guest bathrobes, standing on the terrace I'd built with money I'd earned. "Carol, this is my villa." "I know that. We were here first. Just go home and we'll talk next week." Richard didn't say anything. He was looking at the lake. I thought about arguing. I genuinely considered it, pointing out the obvious, that I'd driven 2 hours, that I hadn't been asked, that the deed had my name, and nobody else's. But something in Carol's face told me she was dug in, and I wasn't going to win a shouting match on my own driveway with my daughter in a bathrobe. So I put my bag back in the car. I drove home. I told myself I was being the bigger person. The truth was, I'd been telling myself that for 3 years. After Linda died, yet I said yes to everything Carol asked. I didn't want to lose the last family I had. I paid for her wedding, $15,000, no questions asked. I bought them a new SUV when Richard's car broke down. $25,000, delivered in a week. I covered the deposit on their apartment, cleared the last of her student loans, paid for the dinner parties she hosted when they were short on cash. Somewhere north of $65,000 total in 3 years, not counting the smaller things. Every time she called, I picked up. Every time she needed something, I said yes. I thought I was being a good father. What I was actually doing was teaching her that I had no limits at all. Monday evening, the phone rang. "Dad?" Carol's voice was flat, businesslike, the voice she used when she'd already decided something and was just notifying me of it. "Richard and I have made a decision about the villa. Harold and Beverly Bennett are going to be living there now. It's their home. You don't need to go back." I actually had to set my coffee mug down, because my hand was shaking. Harold and Beverly Bennett, Richard's parents, people I'd met exactly 4 times. "Carol, they need housing, Dad. Beverly lost her job last month. Harold's pension doesn't cover much. You're alone. You barely use it anymore. It just makes sense. It's my property. You don't have to make this difficult." That word, difficult, like I was being unreasonable, like I was the problem here. I'd written $65,000 worth of checks to this woman over 3 years. I'd driven away from my own villa without a word because she'd asked me to. And now she was calling to tell me that my home, the place where Linda's coffee mugs were still in the cabinet, belonged to strangers, and I was being difficult for objecting. Something shifted inside me right then. Not anger, exactly, more like a door closing. Quietly, firmly, with a click, I felt more than heard. "No," I said. Silence. "Excuse me?" "No, Carol. The answer is no." She hung up. Who called back 30 seconds later. I turned my phone off and sat in my study until well past midnight, with Linda's photo on the desk and 30 years of business instincts coming back online one by one. They'd told me Harold and Beverly were coming to see the villa that Saturday. Saturday was 5 days away. Tuesday morning, I drove downtown to see Neil Foster. Neil has handled my business contracts for 15 years. Real estate attorney, sharp as anyone I've ever worked with, and he doesn't waste words. His office is on the 12th floor with a view of the Sacramento River. Sailboats, morning fog, the kind of view that makes you feel like things can still be worked out if you think clearly enough. I sat down across from his desk and told him everything. The Friday at the villa, the phone call Monday night, Harold and Beverly Bennett already planning to move in. Neil listened without interrupting. When I finished, he picked up his pen. Someone's trying to claim ownership rights they don't have, I said. Family member? My daughter. He nodded once, the way he does when something's messy but solvable. How much time do we have? They're coming to look at the villa Saturday. Then we start today. He pulled out a legal pad. First, your ownership documentation. I want to see every deed, every transfer record, everything tied to that property. Second, we look at protective structures, trust arrangements, LLC options. We make this airtight. What about what she's already done? The calls, the demands? Is any of that actionable? Document everything going forward, dates, times, exact words. If this escalates, contemporary records matter more than memory. He paused. Gary, has she made any written claims? Texts, emails? She texted me that Richard's parents had already booked travel to come see the villa. Screenshot it and send it to me tonight. I left his office feeling like I'd just signed a contract on solid ground. That specific feeling, when a deal is structured right and you know your position is protected, I hadn't felt it in 3 years. Not since Linda died, and I'd spent every day trying to hold on to Carol by giving her whatever she asked for. On the way to the parking garage, Carol called. I answered. She tried a different approach this time. Softer. Dad, I want you to understand the situation with Harold and Beverly. Beverly's been out of work for 2 months. Harold's retirement income barely covers their rent. They're really struggling. That's unfortunate, I said. It doesn't change anything. You have so much, Dad. You have the Sacramento house. You have your savings. What do you actually need the villa for? What did I need it for? The place where Linda picked out every tile, where her reading chair was still by the window. It's not about need, Carol. It's about ownership. You're being selfish. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She hung up. 2 minutes later, a text came through. Richard's parents are still coming Saturday. They've already made travel arrangements. Please don't make this worse than it needs to be. Asterisk. I screenshot it, forwarded it to Neil, and deleted the original. My neighbor Philip Nash lives 3 houses down. He works from home. Software engineer, always has some project running on one of his 3 monitors. The kind of guy who gets genuinely excited when you give him an interesting technical problem. We'd become friends over a drainage issue 2 winters back. His basement flooded. I helped him sort out the contractor situation, and he's been looking for a way to return the favor ever since. I knocked on his door Tuesday afternoon. I need help with a technical project, I told him. Want home automation, motion sensors, voice systems, lighting effects. For some guests who aren't going to be expecting it. Philip looked at me for exactly 1 second, then stepped back from the door. Come in. Tell me everything. We spent 2 hours at his kitchen table going through options. By the time I left, we had a list of equipment and a plan. Wednesday morning, we loaded his SUV and drove up to Lake Tahoe together. The installation took most of the day. Philip worked fast, and he worked clean. Motion sensors in every room, no larger than a smoke detector, completely invisible unless you knew where to look. LED strip lighting behind every fixture, programmable to strobe in sequences he described as the kind of thing that makes your brain stop working properly. Professional-grade speakers mounted behind bookshelves and inside ceiling panels, barely visible even if you were looking for them. A projector system in the main living areas was calibrated to cast moving shadows across walls, shapes that shifted at the edge of your vision, just enough to make you look twice at an empty corner. The voice assistant took Philip the longest to program. He loaded it with a custom sequence. First a firm warning, then an escalating series of announcements, then a final declaration that security protocols had been activated and authorities notified. All of it triggered by motion sensors. All of it coordinated to run simultaneously with the lights, the water systems, and the projections. "The psychology of it," Philip said, adjusting a speaker angle behind the bookshelf, "is that it never lets them orient. Every time they try to make sense of one thing, 3 more start. The brain can't keep up." "How long does the sequence run?" "Continuously, as long as there's motion. If they try to stay still, it pauses, then restarts the moment anyone moves." No safe spot in the house." I walked through the living room as a test. The lights erupted into strobing patterns. A voice filled the room. "This property belongs to Gary Hoffman. You are trespassing. Leave the premises immediately." And from somewhere I couldn't quite locate, a low sound like wind through a closed window started building underneath everything else. Shadows moved across the wall behind the couch. I knew it was Philip's projector. My eyes still went to it. "Oh, that's deeply unpleasant," I said. Philip grinned. "Thank you." The last thing he installed was the backup battery system, hidden in the basement, enough power to run every component for 72 hours, regardless of what happened to the main electrical panel. And a sign, professionally printed and mounted on the front door. "Welcome to the house of the future. Enter at your own risk." We drove home as the sun went down over the Sierra Nevada. Philip talked about the technical details the whole way back. But I watched the road and thought about Saturday. 5 days of patience had built this company. 5 days had built every major deal I'd ever closed. Harold and Beverly Bennett had no idea what was waiting for them. Sunday, May 4th. I was in my study in Sacramento at 2 p.m., 3 monitors glowing with live camera feeds from the villa. Philip had set up the remote viewing system Friday morning. Crisp, high-definition angles covering the driveway, the entryway, the living room, the kitchen, both hallways, and each bedroom. I could see every room simultaneously. I had full control of every system from my phone. Outside the villa, Lake Tahoe was completely calm. Afternoon light on the water. Pine trees not moving. The kind of peaceful afternoon that made you understand why Linda and I had bought the place to begin with. At 2:31 p.m., a dark blue minivan turned onto the approach road. Right on schedule. Carol got out first, the way she always does, moving fast, already talking, taking charge of the situation before anyone else has oriented themselves. Richard followed, then walked around to the rear of the van to start pulling out luggage. Then Harold and Beverly Bennett stepped out. I'd never had a full conversation with Harold and Beverly. I'd met them at the wedding, shook hands, exchanged the usual pleasantries. They seemed like ordinary people. What they were doing now was not ordinary. They moved toward the back of the van with the practiced efficiency of people who had thought carefully about how to pack for a permanent move. Suitcases, boxes, a rolled-up rug. Beverly was carrying a large tote bag, and, I noticed on the camera, I'm not making this up, she already had a pair of house slippers in her hand. ready to change into the moment she got inside. Carol pointed toward the front door, gesturing and talking. Her body language was the most relaxed I'd seen in years. She looked like someone who had handled a difficult situation and come out the other side, like the hard part was over. Then Harold noticed the sign on the front door. I watched him stop and read it. Beverly read it over his shoulder. Harold said something to Carol. I could see him pointing at it. Carol shook her head, laughed, said something brief. Beverly stepped forward, grabbed the sign's mounting bracket with both hands, and yanked it off the wall. She dropped it on the ground and kicked it to the side of the doorstep. I won't have some silly warning ruining our first day in our new home, she said. The audio pickup caught it clearly. Carol started clapping. Perfect! Exactly right! Richard unlocked the front door, using a key Carol had clearly provided him. She copied from the spare she'd had for years. And they walked in. All four of them, stepping over my sign on the way through my front door, into my house. I let them settle in. I watched them on the cameras, unpacking in the bedrooms, Beverly opening cabinet doors in the kitchen to inspect what was there, Harold walking the perimeter of the living room like he was already measuring for furniture. Carol showed Beverly around with the comfortable authority of someone presenting her own property. Richard brought in the last of the luggage and stacked it in the hallway. By 9 p.m., they'd eaten dinner, opened a bottle of wine, and the lights in both bedrooms had gone dark. I gave them an hour. At 10:04 p.m., I pressed execute. The transformation was instant and total. Every light in the villa fired simultaneously, red, blue, white, strobing in the rapid disorienting sequence Philip had programmed, as the kind of pattern that doesn't let your eyes adjust, because it never repeats the same way twice. From the bedroom cameras, I watched Carol bolt upright so fast she hit her shoulder on the headboard. Richard scrambled to his feet and immediately walked into the nightstand. Half a second later, every faucet in the villa opened at full pressure. Both bathrooms, the kitchen, the laundry room, the sound of rushing water filled every room in the house at once, underneath the lights. Underneath everything. Then the voice started. From speakers in the ceiling, the walls, behind the bookshelves, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Attention, unauthorized intrusion detected. This property belongs to Gary Hoffman. You are trespassing. Leave the premises immediately. On the guest room feed, Beverly screamed. Not a short, surprised scream, a sustained, genuine scream of someone who had no framework for what was happening to them. Harold lurched out of bed and hit the floor with one knee, and he grabbed the bed frame and pulled himself up and stood there in the strobing light, turning in circles, completely disoriented. Carol appeared in the hallway. Her hair was sideways, her expression stripped of every bit of the confidence I'd watched her carry through the afternoon. She was shouting something at Richard. He was shouting back. Neither of them could hear the other over the water and the voice system and the lights. Then the projectors activated. Philip had calibrated them for exactly this moment. Shadows that moved along the walls like figures pacing behind the furniture, shapes that shifted at the threshold of your peripheral vision, just real enough that your brain couldn't dismiss them, just wrong enough that it couldn't make sense of them. Beverly came out of the guest room, saw a shadow moving across the far wall of the living room, and pressed herself against the doorframe with both hands over her mouth. Richard found the electrical panel in the utility hallway. I watched him on camera, yanking the main breaker. The overhead lights went out, for approximately 2 seconds. Then Philip's battery backup kicked in, and everything came back on, louder and brighter than before, the voice system now cycling to its second sequence. Warning! Security protocols activated. Authorities have been contacted. And vacate the property immediately. Richard stood in front of the breaker panel with his hands at his sides, staring at it. He tried the breaker again. Same result. He looked like a man who had just discovered that the rules he understood didn't apply anymore. Harold tried to reach the front door. The automated lock held for 28 seconds, long enough to make him yank the handle 4 times before it released. He got the door open, and that was all Carol needed. She pushed past him with Beverly right behind her, and Richard backed out last, still staring at the electrical panel, like he expected it to make sense eventually. They were in the minivan within 4 minutes of the door opening. I watched the headlights come on. I watched them back out of my driveway at a speed that was probably not legal on a residential road. They had lasted 8 hours and 4 minutes in my villa. I turned the systems down to standby, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in my study in the quiet. Carol called at 7:22 a.m. I let it ring twice, then answered. "Good morning." I kept my voice level. "How was your night up at the lake?" What came back wasn't a sentence. It was several sentences, very fast, not all of them finishing before the next one started. The words I could make out clearly were lights everywhere, water, voices, Beverly, panic attack, police, malfunction. I waited until she ran out of speed. "You called the police?" I said. "At 3 in the morning, yes. They came out. They searched the entire house." Her voice was shaking. "They said it was a technical malfunction and a power surge. They found nothing wrong." "Well," I said, "that's a relief. At least you know there wasn't any real danger." "Don't." The word came out flat and hard. "Don't do that voice with me. You did this. I don't know how, but you did this." "Carol, I was in Sacramento all night. I'm 67 years old. How exactly would I control systems at a villa 2 hours away?" Silence. "We're not going back," she said finally. The hysteria had drained out of her voice, and what was left was something hollower. "Harold and Beverly won't go near that place. We're done with it." "That does seem like the sensible decision. This isn't over." I didn't respond to that. There was no point. She was wrong, but she didn't know it yet. That part was coming Monday morning. "Take care of yourself, Carol," I said, and I meant it. Then I hung up. Monday morning I had called Neil Foster before 8 a.m. Yes, the charitable transfer had actually been his suggestion, something he'd floated during our first meeting as the cleanest, most permanent option available. No loopholes, no way to contest it after the fact. No scenario in which Carol or Richard or anyone else could come back later and try again. I'd given him the instruction Friday, the same day Philip and I finished the installation at the villa. While Carol was driving up to Lake Tahoe with Harold and Beverly's luggage in the back of a minivan, Neil was filing paperwork that made the whole trip pointless before it started. The Second Chance Foundation, a legitimate nonprofit that provided housing assistance across Northern California. They'd received the deed to the Lake Tahoe villa on Monday morning, 2 days before Carol's group ever stepped through the front door. The transfer was complete, documented, and irreversible, and I retained lifetime access as the donor. My name stayed on the right to occupy the property for as long as I lived. But ownership, legal, transferable ownership, was gone. There was nothing left to take. Stuart Perkins had the conference room ready at 10 a.m. Thursday. Carol came in first, and I could tell from the way she walked that she'd spent the last 3 days rebuilding her confidence. She'd had time to recover from Sunday night, time to talk to Richard, time to convince herself that what happened at the villa was explainable, and that she still had a position here. She sat down across from me with her jaw set and her hands flat on the table. Richard sat beside her. Harold and Beverly took chairs along the wall. Beverly with her large purse in her lap. Harold looking like a man who had agreed to attend a meeting he didn't fully understand. Stuart stood at the head of the table with a folder open in front of him. "All right," Carol said. "We're here to settle this. The villa transfers to Harold and Beverly. That's the only outcome we're willing to accept." Stuart looked at her calmly. "I'm afraid that's not possible." Everything is possible if Mr. Hoffman no longer owns the Lake Tahoe property. Stewart slid a document across the table toward her. Ownership was transferred to the Second Chance Foundation for Housing Assistance, effective Monday of this week. The transfer is complete and legally irreversible. The room went very quiet. Carol looked at the document. She looked at it for a long time without picking it up. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something almost careful. "That's not real." "It is. You can't just give away property to a charity without—" "Mister, what Hoffman can transfer property he owns to any party he chooses," Stewart said. "He did so legally, with full documentation, before your group arrived at the villa this past weekend." Richard leaned forward. "But he still gets to use it. Carol said he keeps access." "Mr. Hoffman retains lifetime occupancy rights as the original donor." "Yes." "So nothing changes for him." Richard's voice was getting harder. "He keeps using it. We get nothing. And you're telling us this is legal." "That's correct." Carol pushed back from the table slightly, like she needed to physically create distance from what she was hearing. Her face was cycling through things: disbelief, calculation, anger, and underneath all of it, the slow recognition that there was no move left to make. Harold spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet. "So we came all this way. For nothing." I looked at him directly. "You came to take something that wasn't yours. I'd call that a reasonable outcome." Beverly made a sound and looked at the floor. Harold put his hand on her arm. Carol turned to me. The calculated composure was gone. What was underneath it was something rawer, not grief, not guilt, just a kind of exhausted fury. "You were planning this the whole time." "I was protecting what was mine, from the moment you called me Monday night. You let us come up there. You let us think." "You assumed," I said. I didn't tell you anything." She stared at me for a long moment. Then she stood up. Richard stood with her. Harold and Beverly followed. At the door, Carol turned back. "We're done. You understand that? Whatever this was between us, we're done." I held her gaze. "You made that decision when you called me and told me my home belonged to strangers." She left. The door closed behind all four of them with a sound that was quieter than I expected. Stewart and I sat in the conference room for a minute without talking. Outside the window, and Sacramento was going about its Thursday morning, completely indifferent to what had just happened in this room. "Cleanly done," Stewart said finally. 30 years of contracts," I told him. "Always close the deal before the other side knows the meeting has started." Drove up to Lake Tahoe the next morning. It took me about an hour to take down everything Philip had installed: cameras, sensors, speakers, projectors, battery packs. I packed it all carefully into boxes for him. The villa needed to be what it had always been. Not a trap. Not a weapon. Just a house by a lake. When everything was cleared out, I made a pot of coffee and carried my mug out to the terrace. Linda's reading chair was still by the window inside. Her coffee mugs were still in the cabinet. The lake was the same color it had always been in the morning, that particular shade of blue that doesn't look real until you're actually standing in front of it. And I sat there for a long time without doing anything. The thing about 30 years in construction is that you learn to tell the difference between a structure that's sound and one that just looks like it is. Carol and I had been building something that looked like a relationship for 3 years. Regular calls, money when she needed it, patience whenever she pushed. I'd thought I was holding the family together. What I was actually doing was pouring resources into a foundation that had already failed. But you can't fix that by giving more. You fix it by stopping. Linda knew that. She was always the one who could draw a line and make it stick, who understood that love without limits isn't love. It's just a different kind of damage. I'd spent 3 years trying to honor her memory by being patient with Carol, and I'd gotten it exactly backwards. What Linda would have done was what I finally did, 2 weeks later than I should have, but not too late. The morning light moved across the water in the slow way it does when there's no wind. Yet nobody was coming to take this from me. Nobody had a claim on it, legally or otherwise. The foundation that owned it would keep it standing long after I was gone. And until that day, it was mine to sit on this terrace and drink my coffee and watch the light move across the lake exactly the way Linda and I had done it together for 22 years. That was enough. That was more than enough. Some people will only stop taking from you the day you prove, clearly and permanently, that there is nothing left to take. The most expensive thing I ever gave my daughter wasn't the money. It was the years I spent pretending that her taking it was the same thing as her loving me.